where for the last 10, 15 years, we've been trying to work out what a practical expression of Franciscan spirituality might look like in terms of the way that we actually actively manage our land. And I think there's a lot of awareness around Franciscan spirituality and what it has to say to eco-theology and vice versa. There's less perhaps work been done on practical land management inspired by Franciscanism, Franciscan spirituality. I think the reason for that is that Franciscans don't make great land managers, simply because of their commitment to an itinerant lifestyle. So they're very much committed to the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, as opposed to, say, a Benedictine lifestyle, which is more stability, being in a place. So Franciscans move around a lot, and that doesn't lend itself well to land management. But there is a clear mandate, there's a clear pattern for practical land management laid out in Franciscan spirituality. And I just want to have a quick run through of what I think Francis says to us, the way that the Franciscan insights shape my approach, our approach as a community's way of managing the land here. And there's three insights that I just want to run through quickly. And the first is that creation is fundamentally good. And I think this is really important to put this front and center of any discussion of Franciscan spirituality. It might seem very obvious to, well, certainly I hope to all of us who are attending a conference like this, but I think the church has got that message now. But if you look at the time when Francis was living and speaking and preaching, this is actually a really, really important thing for him to stand up and say, because this is the height of the time when the Cathars were active within Europe. And of course, they were standing there saying there's a dualistic nature of reality, that the spirit and everything spiritual is good, and the physical, the creation is bad, is evil, actually. So I think Francis's witness to the goodness, fundamental goodness of creation is really, really central. And we do a misservice if we just skip over that and taking it as given. I mean, there's loads of examples of his dedication to the incarnation, the institution of the idea of crib services, for example, or I mean, the stigmata itself, how much more of actual physical God being with us in the world and how important that is can you have than actually physically manifesting the embodiment of the conclusion of the incarnation, the resurrection in his body. So creation is good. That's a good starting point. The next big insight from Francis that shapes our approach is the idea that everything is gift. Everything in creation is a gift to us, is given to us by God. And this is really important because gifts are significant things. When somebody gives us a gift, that gift takes on something of the nature, of the meaning, of the shape, of the relationship that we have with the one who gives it to us. And I'm going to take a really obvious example, which is my wedding ring, which ostensibly has very little value. It's not worth a lot of money, but it's very significant to me because it stands for, it embodies something of the relationship I have with the one who gives it. So if creation is gift, and if that gift stands for the relationship we have with the giver, i.e. God, it takes on another layer of importance that we should not only just care for creation because it's good and lovely, but really try to deeply understand the meaning of that gift and deeply understand what that gift is trying to tell us about the relationship we need to have with the one who gives it to us. So yeah, it points to the need for a deeper awareness and understanding. And this is where I find sort of the Franciscan insights get really interesting and exciting for me. It leads on to the second point, leads naturally onto it, which is that Francis understood creation as fundamentally relational. He saw everything in creation as interconnected and interdependent and in relationship. And he understood and explained that relationship as being like a family. So that in his famous outpouring of this is the Canticle of the Preachers, or sometimes called Canticle of Brother Sun or Laudato Si, which is obviously a very famous title at the moment. So in that he names everything in creation as brother or sister, so brother sun, sister moon, and so on. And importantly, it's not just naming everything as brother and sister, but it's naming them as brother and sister to us as human beings as fellow siblings. with God as the common father of all of the siblings. And that's a really important thing for us to remember. It's something I think a lot of people have lost track of in the modern world, hopefully not in the church. But we're too often wanting to put ourselves into the kind of primary position and act as if we are the parent figure. But we're really not. Francis is explicitly saying not only is everything brother and sister to each other, but it's brother and sister to humanity. So we are co-siblings, not parents. The other reason I really like this is because as human beings, we all know what it's like to be part of a family or part of a community, whether that's your school community or a work community or your friends or an intentional religious community like here at Hilfield. We all live in community and we all know what it's like to live in community in one way or another. It's hard, it's tough, because there's constant friction and there's constant tension and there's constant negotiation and renegotiation of wants and needs and expectations. And we know what good looks like in a family. We know when things are good in a relationship, in a community, there's generosity, there's love, there's forgiveness, and selflessness. And equally, we all know what bad looks like. We all know how destructive it is when those relationships get out of kilter, and especially when one member tries to act in a domineering way and take over and dictate and not give space for the other members to express themselves. Yeah, so I think that's really important. And the other thing is it's important to remember that actually it's normal and it's natural and it's even healthy and good to an extent to have tension and friction, as long as it doesn't become destructive and hostile, and as long as we can continue to make those relationships work. And we can only do that by holding those relationships in love and in generosity. The other thing I find really exciting about this whole explanation of Francis of everything being interconnected and interdependent is it clearly speaks very strongly to the modern discipline of ecology, ecological science, which is understanding the interactions and relationships between organisms and the rest of the natural world, animate and inanimate. So it's very much relational. And it very much, the language of ecology is very much the language of tension, of conflict, of friction. We talk about competition and things like this. And I find it really interesting actually that Francis had this insight with no scientific training whatsoever 800 years ago. It's only really come into the fore in the last, 40, 50 years in the Western scientific paradigm. But the problem for us as humans in the way we relate to the land is that too often not just relate to land, relate to each other as well, but we're talking about land management, but it's that too often we don't want to engage with the friction and the tension. We don't want to live in that and inhabit that because it's uncomfortable. It's painful and it's costly to try to deal with that and to keep coming back to love. It's much easier if we can just have things our way and shut the door in the face of everything else. We can just have our own will, and that's when we start to act as a domineering bully, as a parent figure. That's when we start to take over and become tyrants, really, rather than being co-siblings with the rest of creation. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the kind of three main points of Franciscan spirituality that are my mandate for land management. And I just want to run through a couple of examples, a couple of kind of stories, really, of the lived experience of that here in the communities that we share this place with. I don't know if I can share my screen. I've got a couple of pictures, if that's possible. Can I do that? Yes. I may, but can I is another question. Here we go. Can you see that? I assume you can. So the Friary is home to several really stunning, beautiful wildflower meadows like this one. And these are amazing, diverse, beautiful communities. But like all communities, there's pretty much in every community one or two key members of the community they're the key kind of drivers. They're the ones that put energy, they're the ones that give direction. That's where the life is often. And we have those people in every community, whether that's a natural community like a wildflower meadow, or whether it's a human community. And we need those people, we need those individual community members. But the problem is that those members tend to become, there's a tendency for them to be too boisterous and too energetic and potentially to take over. And at that point, their energy can become destructive and debilitating and limiting to others' expression of themselves. And yeah, we all know people like that. You know, they're often central to a community. They're often really good friends, really popular people, and we all know the good and the bad expressions of that. And it's quite good doing this on Zoom, because normally everybody turns and looks at somebody who's generally totally oblivious of the fact that it's them. But this isn't a negative story about those people or those members of communities. This is a positive, because it's about balance. Because yeah, in a grassland, that member is grass. The dominant member is sister grass. And we want grass, we need the grass, because it's the growth and interaction with grazing animals of the grass that make a grassland a grassland. And without that, it doesn't exist. But it does have a tendency to dominate and take over. If I show you another example of a grassland, this might be more the kind of thing that you might see. This is a typical kind of agricultural monoculture green desert that you might see in most UK farmed grasslands. And yeah, grass will just take over. So we need to do something to try to hold it in check, to try to balance its growth, but not to eliminate it, just to keep it in balance. And generally, if we don't keep the grass in check, we get this monoculture, and if we can get the diversity that we saw before. So we need to understand grass, and we need to understand what are the things that cause it to get out of hand. And the main thing with grass is fertility. When there's high fertility in the soil, the grass will grow rampantly and take everything over. So here at Hilfield, our main way of trying to manage this relationships within this community to keep the grass in check and allow the other members of the community to have a chance to express themselves is to reduce the fertility. And the main way we do that is by cutting the grass when it's nice and big and grown to make hay. And essentially we're removing the biomass and nutrients that grass has put into itself throughout the summer. And that's what, well, we at Hilfield, and I think everybody who has anything to do with the land's been mad crazy trying to do the last 2 weeks, because it's just been the right weather, and you know, make hay when the sun's shining and all the rest. So yeah, cutting to remove the biomass and hold the grass in check. But there's other really exciting examples of things that we can do. And I'm just going to share one with you. This is another really great plant. This is yellow rattle, which is a really, really useful tool in the management of grass and in the creation of wildflower meadows, because it's very, very useful at holding the grass in check. It's kind of semi-parasitical on the grass, so it sticks its roots into the grass's roots and it steals nutrients from the grass and it weakens the grass. Crucially, it doesn't kill the grass or eliminate the grass or remove the grass. It just keeps the grass in check a little bit, and that just provides that little bit of space for the wildflowers to do their thing. And this is the point where you see, if you're really lucky, and a group can all look at somebody who's doing that role. Not all groups have someone who's doing the yellow rattle job, but we should try to cultivate that. But I really love this idea of working with the relationship between grass and yellow rattle and other plants, because it's very much in line with this whole relational notion, rather than me as a land manager for good and noble purposes deciding my will is I want to have wildflowers and I'm going to go out there and do it on my own and chop all the grass down and I'm a hero. I'm actually trying to work within the relationships that are already there and established. And if that goes well, we can get some real beauties. I'm just going to bring up a picture of a fly orchid. This is one of our rarest plants we have at the Friary, real stunner. And I'm going to talk about orchids a little bit, but I want to be absolutely clear that the beauty and diversity that we have in the meadow only exists because of the competition and the tension and the way that the wildflowers have to compete with the grasses. It's not instead of, it's absolutely only because of it. And if we look at orchids as an example, they're great because they've got many unique, stunning, creative adaptations that allow them to flourish that are the result of this competition. So this is a fly orchid, and it looks like a fly to us, but it's actually trying to look like, and crucially smell like, a particular species of wasp. It looks and smells like a female wasp to the male wasp, and the male wasp comes along and tries to mate with the flower, and gets a little blob of pollen stuck on the back of its head, and hopefully goes off and tries to mate with another one. And what's going on there? Why would a flower do this? Well, the normal arrangement is that flowers produce nectar, which the insect that's pollinating them feeds on the nectar. That's the benefit, and hopefully affects pollination by going to another flower of the same species. But nectar is sugar, it's energy. So if you're going to produce that, you need lots of energy. So if there's a low nutrient, low fertility situation like you have in a wildflower meadow, if you're able to circumvent the need for nectar by having a clever trick, you're saving a vast amount of energy. So that's one adaptation to these kind of low nutrient situations. Another interesting one, which is true from pretty much all orchids, I think all orchids actually, is that the seeds are absolutely tiny. They're dust-like. You would think that it's pollen if you saw it. And the reason for that is that the orchid seed actually has no energy store whatsoever, which again is a great advantage to have no energy store, because the plant doesn't have to bother putting any energy into it. If you think about why are nuts and cereals so nutritious, because the plants put energy in to get that seed growing and get it started. The orchids don't have to do that. They don't bother with any of that. So it saves them a huge amount of energy, and gives them, again, a competitive advantage. Of course, it's a big disadvantage because they need energy to grow. And therefore, the orchids have become dependent on special association with particular fungi. They require that fungi to actually penetrate the seed and start to give nutrients to the seed in order to facilitate germination. But that's a whole other story about relationship. But it's these adaptations only exist because of the competitive pressure of having to grow where there's low nutrients to give them the advantage over the otherwise robust sister grass. And the wildflower meadows are full of examples of this. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but we haven't got hours. There's hundreds of examples. Every plant really has something to tell us about this relationship and about the creative outcomes of tension and competition when it's held in balance. And I would just encourage you, come to Hilfield, and I'd love to show you the meadows in person. It's much better to talk about these things when the plants are in front of us. I mean, what I've got to tell you right now, though, is actually, in this respect, humans are really a bit of a sister grass. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing or a negative thing, but we are one of these really key, essential members of the community, really driving it. We've got the energy, we've got the creativity, we've got the potential, but like the grass, we need to be held a little bit in check and be held a little bit in balance. Otherwise, there's not space for the other members of the community to flourish and express themselves. So it's not a bad thing, as it isn't with the grass. It's just the way that we are. But we have to learn how to mediate that relationship with the other members of our community. So let me get rid of this and I'll stop sharing. You can see my ugly face. There we go. I want to just change gear now and talk about the time when I was running the kitchen garden. I'm not running the kitchen garden anymore, but I did run the Friary kitchen garden for about 10 years. And during that time, the thing that really excited me about doing the gardening was exploring a Franciscan approach to pests, insect pests, to disease, and to weeds. So sticking with the plants, that's what we've been talking about, I'm going to just have a little bit of a look. What would a Franciscan approach to weeds look like? Well, go back to the start. If everything's good, everything's gift, everything belongs together in relationship, and everything's telling us something about the nature of the relationship that we should have with God and with other members of the community, where do weeds sit in that? Well, the first thing that we need to do to understand this is take a step back from our own limited perspective as mere siblings and try and see it in the context of the relationships of the whole family, which is normally the way to deal with problems in a family, rather than just looking at our own needs and what it's costing us and how it's making us feel. We need to kind of take the bigger picture, take a step back and look at the entire family relationship. What's causing the friction and the tension? Where are the rubbing points? And then we can begin to try and work out a more equitable solution rather than how can I get what I want? how can we have a right relationship within the community? It's a much more important question from a Franciscan point of view. So we need to take that step back and understand what's happening in the relationship. And the more that I did this in the garden, the more that I realized that actually, generally speaking, the dysfunctional aspects of the relationship were caused by us as human beings and what we were doing. So it suddenly throws the responsibility back on us. So yeah, just looking at weeds, if we're going to find a creative way of making this relationship work, we need to understand each other. So we need to understand and celebrate what are the weeds about. And if we look at that, the plants that we generally label as weeds, I should say, was a bit of a mouthful. So if you can just read that, if I say weeds, I mean the plants conventionally labeled as weeds. If we look at them from an ecological point of view, the way ecology would talk about them is they'd say that they're pioneer species. They're kind of classic pioneer species. So these are species that are adapted to take advantage of what would be called a disturbance episode, i.e. there's a forest fire, a tree falls down, a pig comes and digs up the ground, there's a flood, something causes a disturbance in the ecosystem. And if you think about these disturbance episodes, there's an opening in the vegetation, and there's also an enrichment of an increase in fertility in the soil generally. A fire, flood, a pig pooing, whatever, whilst it's digging, there's an increase in fertility and a disturbance. So pioneer species are adapted to take advantage of this by growing really, really fast, being very robust, and being really, really efficient at making good use of nutrients. And basically, when we're digging our garden constantly and putting fertilizer on it, we're creating an artificial prolonged disturbance period. It's not the weeds' fault. They're just doing the job that they've been adapted to do, but we're creating this circumstance that's making the conditions absolutely perfect for the weeds. So I say it kind of throws the spotlight back on us a little bit. But that doesn't mean we can't just not have gardens or grow food, because we need to eat. We also have needs, same as the weeds do. But by rewinding and understanding the relationship, it allows us to be a bit more creative, a bit more dynamic, a bit more balanced in the response that we take. And hopefully, rather than just eliminating weeds, trying to learn how can we live alongside each other and how can we have balance in that relationship. And I'm just going to run through one or two examples of that quickly. Species generally labelled as weeds. Classic one would be nettles, typical pioneer species, loves disturbs ground, loves high nutrients. Bit difficult to have it in the bed in the garden where you're trying to grow stuff. Absolutely fantastic if you can even make a tiny, tiny space for it in your garden, because they are beneficial in many ways. So they're dynamic accumulators. They'll concentrate nutrients, which many pioneer species will, which you can then use to make your own homemade fertilizer. But they're also fed on by species-specific aphids that will only feed on nettles, which is great, because if you have aphids, you have things that predate on aphids. And if the aphids only feed on the nettles, they're not spreading to your crop. That's useful. You've then got a whole load of ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies, etc., buzzing around your garden, controlling the aphids for you. Same with caterpillars. Most of our really beautiful butterflies, like your peacock and red admiral, the caterpillars feed on nettles, which is great because we all love those butterflies, but also it's a source of food for the things that predate on butterflies that can then help to control caterpillars on the rest of your crops that you want to grow. So there's lots of examples of that, and we're sort of running a bit tight on time, but there's all other kinds of responses. There's no dig and permaculture, and they all have things to their credit, but the main thing is just changing the narrative. Stop talking about things as problem species to be battled, and more about understanding relationships with other siblings. And if I've got a minute, I just want to give one final example, which is one of my favorite ones, which is this idea of the three sisters, which was a way of growing three crops together that was practiced throughout Central America for hundreds and hundreds of years. And those three crops complement as well as compete with each other. And the crops were sweet corn, squash or pumpkins, and beans. And the sweet corn provides height, structural support, and shade. It's hot and dry, so shade is obviously good. The squash or pumpkins kind of scrabbling over the surface, that's providing shade, it's retaining moisture within the soil and suppressing weeds. And then you've got your beans, which climb up the sweet corn, and they are leguminous, so they have this special symbiotic relationship with certain fungi in the roots, and they're able to fix nitrogen, which is the main nutrient that all of these plants need, and they make that available to the other plants. So yeah, as humans, we can really see the benefit of growing these three plants together. But I just want you to think about, I wonder how the sweet corn felt or feels when the beans wrap around its leaves and the leaf can't open. Is that what the sweet corn would want? Does that mean that it's not good for them to be in relationship with each other? And there I'll stop. I think we're tight on time, and I'd love to try and answer some questions. Do I just run through the chat, or?
Yeah, Rich, there's one chat that was really, how has the garden at Hilfield developed or changed over time? In the case of building on what's gone or doing things?
Both. Both really. Actually, interestingly, one of the volunteers just asked me, how is the garden different now under the current garden manager than when I did it? Every gardener has a different outlook and a different perspective, and I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong. It's one of the things I love about gardening. Everyone is the world's #1 expert in their own garden. So yeah, building on it, doing new things, they're not mutually exclusive, but it's doing all right. Yeah, it's still there, and we're still eating from it. It's beautiful.
Lots of other just comments saying great imagery, viewing the mess and the wonder, which I think is really good. Completely changing the way I think about weeds and pests. Really interesting. That was from Luke, and I think that might all that we have time for. Richard, thank you so much. Really fascinating. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. Let's give Richard a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And do be in touch. Thanks, everyone. Off
Bye.
to the next question. Thank you.